OODAcast, informing your decisions with intelligence, analysis, and insight. Brought to you by the team at OODAloop.com.
Hello, I'm Bob Gorley with OODA. Today we're bringing some of the experience and expertise from the OODA network to a very interesting development in the SolarWinds case. The first ever issuing of a Wells Notice to a Chief Information Security Officer. Now, this is actually the second Wells Notice in this case. The first was back in October, issued to the corporation. And at that time, the SEC told SolarWinds that they had issues with some of their disclosure processes and some of their internal processes. This second Wells Notice apparently was sent to two individuals, the Chief Financial Officer and, as I mentioned, for the first time in history, the CISO. Now, we'll get into the background of this breach, and we will then discuss the Wells Notices and, more importantly, the so what about this from the standpoint of corporate directors and boards and the security community and what we should all be doing now that we're informed about this. If you're interested in more in-depth details about this topic, including what your board should do, please reach out. Would love to hear from you. I've asked two of our OODA network experts, Bob Floras and Junaid Islam, both close friends and associates I've worked with for decades, to help us examine the nuances of this situation. Bob is an experienced CTO and CISO who has sat on corporate boards and advised many other corporations on how to mitigate risk. He, like me, is a certified QTE, or board qualified technical executive, skilled in delivering business value to corporate boards and seeking to mitigate systemic risk. Junaid Islam has created and led corporations and is also known for his ability to mitigate risk for large enterprises. He's also an inventor. He's created many of the software protocols that make our long-haul telecommunication systems work so well today. Both Bob and Janae know security and they know technology leadership. Now, before getting into the discussion, I wanted to briefly give an overview of what has happened in the past with SolarWinds. It's one of the most famous cases in cybersecurity and corporate risk mitigation. But just to recap, in late 2020, there was a discovery by one of their partners, FireEye, who was a user of a key SolarWinds product called Orion. And that discovery led to a rapid investigation that revealed that the SolarWinds core product called Orion had been compromised. Someone had compromised the build environment that maintains the software code and inserted some malicious code in there, a Trojan, a backdoor. Quickly, people assessed that, hey, this is probably a nation state. It looks like it's an espionage kind of attack. And yes, as the investigation developed, it was determined that it was a Russian intelligence service. Who was impacted by this? Corporations around the world and governments around the world, including the US government, which had extensive use of this SolarWinds software. It does so many important things to help manage an enterprise. Once this software was updated and the malicious code in the Orion software was in your enterprise, the Russian intelligence services could take control of a network and start covertly moving data out. Now, when this was discovered, I empathized with SolarWinds. I think a lot of others did too, because who can withstand an attack from a hostile nation state that is doing this for espionage kind of purposes? It's tough. And I think, sure, anybody can do things to make it harder on the bad guys, but it's tough for a small business to withstand that kind of attack. So I think a lot of us empathized with them. There were then, there's always reasons to criticize, and you can find reasons to criticize. And some of those reasons to criticize here resulted in lawsuits. There were several lawsuits against SolarWinds brought by shareholders and groupings of shareholders. Most of those were settled. One was dismissed and then appealed, and just now was given a final dismissal. So from the shareholder lawsuit perspective, things were all getting wrapped up for SolarWinds. The basic point of these lawsuits were shareholders and representatives of shareholders said that the corporate directors at SolarWinds should have done more. They were all too busy. They were sitting on too many other boards. Most of them were from the cybersecurity community. They should have known something should be done. Well, the court essentially said that, well, look, they did not aggressively go out to violate the law. So this particular suit is not going to hold water, and it was dismissed. There's a whole lot of other legal examination that needs to be done for a full picture there. But I wanted to say that those lawsuits are not the only challenge that SolarWinds had. We know that the SEC was doing an investigation, and there was a lot of dialogue with SolarWinds. That's all public. And then in October of last year, the SEC issued this thing called a Wells Notice, which is the SEC saying we may take action to include civil suit against you. And we know, based on what the CEO of SolarWinds said, this is because of things SEC said were issues with their disclosures involved in this, as well as internal controls and internal procedures. Then we just found out last week that the SEC sent a Wells notice to both the CFO and the CISO. We don't know what was in that Wells notice. We have to assume that it was similar to the one sent to the company. So these two could be accused of either not having appropriate internal controls or not doing the appropriate disclosures. That brings us up to where I think we are today. And I wanted to ask Bob and Junaid first for any broad comments, including on my introduction of you guys. Bob and then Junaid, would you give a brief introduction of yourself so people know your background?
Yeah, so I grew up at the CIA and spent 31 years there, eventually becoming the enterprise chief technology officer, but spent essentially 30 years protecting data. And so anyway, that's me. And since that time, I've done work with OODA and others, both with Mr. Gorley here and with Janae as well. And I run my own consulting company that provides virtual CISO services, as well as all kinds of other security things like, assessments and get well plans, that sort of thing. So that's me in a nutshell.
Cool. Junaid?
Hi, my name is Junaid Islam. I've been involved in secure comms 35 years, all the way back from the first Gulf War, then really protocol design from MLPP for weapons control to MPLS routing. Most recently, actually worked for Bob Floras. I was a researcher at Science and Technology and helped work on something called C2S access control, which became zero trust networking. It's all public domain. And so I'm very focused on the protocols, not just to protect networks, but also the protocols cyber attackers use to break into networks. That's kind of my focus area.
All right, guys. So what do you think regarding this Wells notice to a CISO? What kind of message do you think this sends to the cybersecurity community overall?
Well, for me, I think that looking at it from a big picture standpoint, it's that, gosh, if I'm a CISO, not only do I have to be worried about bad guys breaking into my place, I have to be worried about the legal implications of that happening. And this is something that, as a CISO, I figured, I don't have to worry about that. That's more for the board of directors to worry about. They're the ones with fiduciary responsibility to keep the company running in an appropriate manner. Well, this changes that. And I don't know what the Wells notice said, but typically these things, as you said, Bob, are released and sent out when the SEC believes there's some kind of malfeasance that's going on. So this should be a wake-up call, absolutely. And it makes you wonder, next time you interview for a CISO job, there may be a whole bunch of other questions you need to be asking the people that are trying to hire you. So,
all right,
Janae?
What do you think, Jen?
Yeah, I'd like to build on Bob Floras' comments. First, personally, I was completely surprised by this action by the SEC. At a personal level, I thought, wow, the SEC's become an expert in cybersecurity. I didn't know, because this is a very specific case that involves really a very sophisticated attack by Russia to compromise digital certificates and get into the solar winds control channel. So, you actually have to know quite a bit of technology to even understand the attack, let alone to decide to take action against a company based on that. So this definitely is new ground for everybody, including the SEC. So building on what Bob Floras said, I think the approach the board of directors takes on cybersecurity really is not enough. Today, it's all compliance driven, and few companies take the extra step at looking at state-sponsored cyber attacks on their supply chain or global operations. And this has really happened because of the issues in Ukraine and the issues in China. But now people really need to go to the broader level and look at the regulatory framework, and the boards need to look and see if things they are doing or not doing could get them in trouble with the SEC or the Department of Justice. So I think from a cyber risk perspective, boards definitely need to escalate this issue and take a much broader viewpoint to make sure items like this don't happen again. Now, on a longer term basis, I actually don't think this case will go through, because there's so much new legal ground that at some point in the process it'll get stuck. I think longer term, what we need is a risk sharing between the intelligence community, the Department of Justice, and public companies, where the intelligence community alerts a U.S. company that they are under attack, and then they take corrective action with the help of the Department of Justice. And if they don't, then you could say, hey, we told you and you didn't do the right thing. Here, this is a little bit unusual, where I would say the intelligence community knew about the activities against SolarWinds for years before the attack, and did not disclose it to them. So so my prediction is this case will not go through. Having said that, the point that Bob Floras made, which is boards need to look at a cybersecurity from a comprehensive perspective, that needs to happen no matter what. Compliance is not enough. Look at your global supply chain, look at where you're operating, and now look at the regulatory framework. I think every board needs to do that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I do want to dive a little deeper into that. I also want to say it's a very interesting hypothetical you just raised there. And that, did the government know about this beforehand? And is there any indication they were just monitoring and watching it happen? If so, I'd be extremely disappointed. And I don't think that happened, but still, it's an interesting hypothetical to think about. And also, I want to circle back to something that Bob kind of said. Like, if you're a CISO hiring for looking for a job, you're being interviewed for a position, it may change the nature of the kind of questions you need to ask before accepting that position. Like what, Bob? What were you thinking?
Well, I part of it would be, the directors and the executives of a company typically have something called directors and officers insurance. So one of the first questions I would ask is, am I, as the CISO, covered under the D&O insurance? And if not, why not? In the past, I wouldn't have really worried about that, because I would have figured, nobody's going to come after me from a legal standpoint. As long as I can at least show that, I use best practice or whatever. I mean, obviously anybody can be found guilty of negligence, but so anyway, the first question I would ask is about D&O insurance. Am I covered or am I not covered?
Yeah, that sounds like a good one. And then just make sure that you get that in writing. And then another follow-on question would be, if the SEC comes at me, are you going to have my back? Will you help defend me?
Well, and building on Bob Floras' comment, the second thing I would ask is, if you are the CISO and you find something or something is urgent, will the CEO and the board approve the expenditure? I mean, one of the problems that happens in every company, and we know this, security is an afterthought. It's low on the priority, and it's, no matter what happens, your funding can be taken away. I mean, this is a constant struggle. So now this is quite real, where the CISO finds something and people say, well, funds are tight and we're not going to do it this year, we're going to do it next year. I mean, this is so that the issue now becomes, when that happens, what does that mean for the company? Will the CISO be able to get this in writing, where he said, oh, I asked for something and you turned it down for good reason, or do we just push it aside? Because if the thing the CISO asked for, and this will be interesting in the SolarWinds case, if SolarWinds did do corrective action and it failed, I mean, we don't know, but you could certainly see this happening in other cases where CISOs will pull out an old email and so do I. Look at this email, I told the CEO, I told the CFO, and they didn't do anything, right? So I think now CISOs should certainly consider putting everything in writing to the executive staff and getting a response and recording it in case there is legal action against their company. They can certainly document what they told the executive staff and what happened. It's very unfortunate that, and that's going to create tension, but here we are, and we have no choice.
Right. Well, guys, what do you think boards should be doing, publicly traded corporation boards, to mitigate cybersecurity issues today? Besides the old, let's ask smarter questions, what can boards do to really get at this problem?
Well, I think that, and the SEC has identified this issue already, but the majority of the boards, at least in the United States, while they have, all well-intentioned board members for the most part, there are very, very few of them that really understand cybersecurity and the risks associated with cybersecurity. And so the boards need to do a better job of trying to understand that. And it's certainly, one way they could do that is send everybody to school and let them all do internships, for the summer as a deputy CISO or whatever. Well, it's not very cost effective, time effective to do something like that. So the answer there is kind of what the SEC came up with and said, look, you got to have somebody on your board who understands this stuff. It's not, part of it is asking the right question, but then you got to understand the answer and the implications of the answer. And you got to be able to read through the compliance stuff and understand where's the actual security here. As we know, and I would hope most of the people listening to this know, compliance is not the same thing as security. If you are secure, you will almost certainly be compliant, but the reverse is not necessarily true. So,
Yep. I think it's a message that we ought to stay on. It's so important because it's been true for the longest time, and it will continue to be true. I'm convinced.
So just building on Bob Floras' point that compliance is not enough, I think we cannot escape the reality that the United States is in a war with Russia and China. I mean, and I know that boards don't like to use words like that because it's very frightening. But the reality is we have two countries who are autocratic regimes, who do not believe in democracy, who certainly don't believe in an open economy, and are targeting every American company. So what does this mean? What it means is you are a part of the mix no matter what. And boards typically, as Bob Floras mentioned, will look at compliance, which might be 15 minutes out of a 2-hour board meeting, and then move to the next topic. The reality is we have to look at the global environment and what's happening with these two countries who are not good players or not good actors. And then what does it mean for their business at the board level? And then derive what does it mean for their operations, all operations, manufacturing, sales, and then derive what does it mean from a cybersecurity perspective. So I think the way their approach is backwards. They do their 15-minute compliance check and they're done and they go to the next topic. It has to be the other round. Let's look at the global geopolitical situation. Let's look at our role as an American company. We play in that, whether it's a product or service. What does it mean? What's our brand? And then from there, go to the IT infrastructure first, and what's our exposure, and then the cyber piece, and then the compliance piece. So So I think this is a fundamental rethink boards require. It is painful and time consuming, but I think it's necessary. I don't think we have a choice as an open democratic society because of what's happening with our adversaries.
Yeah, I agree with you on a lot of this. I've been an Intel officer for a long career, and then worked in and around the community, and worked cybersecurity since the late 90s. And I've always believed that an understanding of the threat can motivate the right action. However, I have seen my belief fail. I have seen people be aware of the threat and then not do the right action, maybe out of ignorance or desire for it to just go away. And so I wanted to come back and ask both you guys to, okay, let's say you're aware of the threat. What do you do about it if you are a corporate director?
Yeah, so it's, it all comes down to making a risk decision, right? I mean, you could have a threat against your business that has nothing to do with cybersecurity, and you as a director on the board make those kinds of decisions all the time as to, okay, what do we do about this? Anything? If you look at things and say, okay, well, we have a problem here. The CFO says if things go south on us, it's going to cost $1,000, and yet it's going to cost $1 million to fix the problem. Well, the answer is obvious. I mean, you don't do anything about it, because no company is going to spend $1 million to fix $1,000 problem. My point here is you've got to analyze the situation, and you've got to really understand what is the cost of not doing anything, not just in dollars and cents, although that's the example I gave, but what's the cost of your brand?
Yeah.
You get big companies, they rely on their brand, and if something steps in to destroy that brand, well, then your competitor basically takes over, right? So,
yeah. One other comment I think gets at all of this. The SEC is going to issue their final regulations, so not guidance, but regulations in October. And among other things, that's going to say, do you have somebody on the board who does cyber stuff? And from my understanding, it's not going to say that you must do that, but it's quite a nudge, isn't it? It's like saying, hey, shouldn't you? And then they have some other procedures that they articulate in there, some processes and controls you have to have. Now, one thing that many corporations have considered is creating a committee of the board, a cyber committee. And this is all public information, but 9 years ago, VeriSign created a cyber committee. They're right down the road here from me, and I've always thought that was smart. Their business model is all about trust, and by forming a committee, you have a way where certain board members can stay more continuously engaged, and management has a way to work with the board continuously on cyber. Gartner has recently come out and said they predict that over the next 2 years, 40% of the publicly traded companies will form cyber committees. And I wonder, in the SolarWinds case, if they would have had a cyber committee, if they would be getting Wells notices right now.
Yeah, so I got to tell you, Bob, I think that depends on who's on that committee. And, if you put the CFO on the committee along with, I don't know, maybe the CFO is the only person on the committee, or you get the CFO and the CEO, and they are the cybersecurity committee. That's not going to do much for you, frankly.
Yeah.
You still got to have somebody there. I love the idea of a committee, but you got to have at least one person on that committee who really knows what this is all about. Think of the audit committee in a company. I mean, you don't ever pull together an audit committee in a board of directors that doesn't have somebody on it who understands how to run the numbers. It's what you're looking for there is internal fraud, and how can you do that if you don't really understand the problem? So, so there still has to be this change in mindset, is really what it is, amongst the public boards, that they have to get their act together on this. So,
right.
I would kind of agree. I think the idea of a board member who oversees the cybersecurity aspect is a good first step, but a lot of it is going to be based on the execution. at a bare minimum, I would ask that the board member who leads the committee create a cross-functional team. The cross-functional team should include the IT organization, as well as the cybersecurity team, as well as the compliance team. And they need to take this seriously and at least one day a quarter, set the whole day aside. And this is not burdensome. So it's not like you have to meet every month for a whole day, but this is so serious that for public companies, at least one day a quarter, have everybody involved in the entire workflow or process model of the company, and look at everything from a cyber perspective. The other thing I do is invite people, perhaps from the intelligence community who are retired, who can at least talk about the notion of what's happening at a state-sponsored cyber attack level, to raise the awareness, because it's too easy to kick off a meeting and for people to say, well, I read this on the internet, versus having someone who might be a retired NSA or CIA person who will speak about it in the first person, which I think will help ground the meeting and say, oh, this is real. Here's this person. So, wow, this really happened, right? And it's just going to make people react differently versus, I read this on the internet or I saw a YouTube video. So I do think if companies are willing to take this moderate baby step of a day a quarter with a board member, with all of the teams, I think we can get out of this rut of thinking about cybersecurity in a compliance framework and really think about it from the notion of maintaining business operations, which is the right way to look at cyber expenditure. What do we need to spend to keep our global operations going, whether it's backing up the data so we don't get hit by ransomware, whether it's implementing zero trust partitioning, so operations in one country, if they get hacked, it doesn't spill over to another country, or even how we handle information sharing within our company, right? So, this is a big task, but I think if people are willing to spend a day a quarter, you can head in the right direction. There's nothing magical about Russia and China. They're not geniuses.
Yeah, I think you make some very good points about specific actions that can be done. And I have seen firsthand, I know you guys have too, the power of things like training before the incident, or executive level conversations, executive level tabletop exercises, where you see people from across the corporation, multiple disciplines, being walked through scenarios and then asked, what would you do when this unfolds? That can really have an impact on your policies, plans, procedures, and what you really do when there is an incident.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of training, not so much go into a classroom and have a lot of book learning thrown at you, but experiential kind of training. So tabletop exercises really help to do that.
Great. Well, guys, I would say one theme that we have hit on from the very beginning to the very end is this fact that compliance does not equal security. And that is an important adage in our community. And Bob, I think you put it extremely well, that if you're secure, you're more than likely going to be compliant. If you're compliant, that doesn't hold true. And I think this is an important question to end on. I just wanted to say, is this something for the compliance team to lead?
I don't think so, because the compliance team, I don't want to be too bad-mouthing about them, but the compliance teams have become box checkers. And so they look at things from a very discrete standpoint. Well, are we doing this? This government agency says we got to do X, Y, and Z. Are we doing X, Y, and Z? Yes, we are. No, we're not. Well, okay, where's the question that says, yes, we're doing it, but we're not doing it very well, or we are doing it very well, or we're doing it, but we're still losing, our IP out the door, or whatever it is. And so you have to be very, very careful about that. And because you get into this mindset and you get blinders on. And so, again, I think it has to be looked at from an overall risk standpoint. And as you put it well, Bob, No, actually, it was Janae who said this. It's really about the business and running the business. Okay, it isn't about, at the end of the day, it's not about are you secure or aren't you secure. It's really about, can you sustain your business based on the practices that you have today? The answer may be yes, great. It also may be no, not so great.
Right. Janae, do you have thoughts on this?
Just a kind of closing thought. I think, unfortunately, what you're seeing with SolarWinds is just the beginning. Now that the SEC has taken action, it's really actually not stoppable. I do think this case will fail just because the legal ground is so new. But this doesn't mean that there's going to be not more of this. So I think we're now on a path that cannot be shut down, where the government will open itself. So I think, if anything, what the SEC is minor compared to what the Department of Justice can do. SEC would not have taken action without close coordination with the Department of Justice. That is just impossible. So I without knowing it, here's my very negative prediction that there's a bunch of cases further down in the pipeline that they would have had briefings with the Department of Justice. So I think this is the reality we live in. As we've discussed on the call, the board of directors should be looking at risk much more broadly from a global operational perspective in the context of what Russia and China are doing. This is not hypothetical. They are basically undermining U.S. companies and European companies around the world. I mean, this is just the world we live in. So, but having said that, there's no battle we cannot win. And just like every other engagement we've had with Russia and China, we will win. But we just need to focus on it, and we will win.
Right. Yeah, and I would say that's a very, very good point. We can make it much harder on the bad guys, even if you realize you are going to be surprised at some time in the future, and it's important to have an incident response plan. You can make it harder on the bad guys for really very low cost and mitigate some of this systemic risk.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Bob. So, but there has to be a willingness to do it.
Yep, totally agree. Well, hey, thanks, Bob and Junaid, for helping us explore these ideas. And I think it's critically important that boards continue to educate themselves on cyber matters. And boards should also realize that they need to tap into experts like you guys who have been there and have deep expertise in both technology and business and mitigating cyber risk. So thanks.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.